I'm Shannon Trapphagen, and welcome back to Food for Thought, the channel where I discuss healthier recipes and swapping out ingredients for some of the most common recipes we can find on the Food Network and the Cooking Channel. Thank you for following me, and thank you for coming back to my channel. You can always follow some of these recipes on my website at smtrapphagen.com, and you can always look for some of my food reviews and some of my very own recipes that I create myself on my blog, Digestion Suggestion. So today, what I decided to do was take a really common recipe, tuna noodle casserole. It's a recipe that all of us love to make. It's super easy, it's fun for the kids to even get involved with cooking it, and it's really great for the whole family to eat. I found a simple recipe on the Cooking Channel, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to list the ingredients for you that it already calls for, and then I'm going to tell you what ingredients to swap it out with to make it a healthier recipe for you. So the ingredients we already have listed on here are unsalted butter. I tend to use Smart Balance butter. It's a little bit healthier, and I always cut the recipe in half when it comes to the amount of butter they call for. Yellow onion, salt and freshly ground black pepper. Now, I always tend to use sea salt, and I always want to use iodized sea salt. Iodized sea salt is actually healthier for you, and the iodization is really good for your thyroid health. So I always like to grab sea salt, and I always make sure that it's iodized. You want mushrooms, sherry, cooking sherry, soy sauce, flour. Now with this, I use wheat flour instead of white flour, and this is where we're going to substitute, and I'll explain why. The recipe calls for chicken broth, milk, lemon juice, peas, canned tuna in oil, egg noodles, grated Parmesan, and breadcrumbs. Now here are the ingredients that we're actually going to be swapping out. This is super simple to do and very easy for all of you. But as you start learning what ingredients can be substituted, you can create your own recipes, and that makes it so much fun and so much easier for you to control eating healthier with some of your favorite recipes from some of your favorite chefs from places like the Food Network and the Cooking Channel. So the first ingredient I really want to talk about is the wheat flour. Now, some of these recipes aren't going to be made for everybody, because those of you who have celiac or might be gluten-free would have to substitute something like almond flour instead of wheat flour. But for those of you who can, wheat flour is actually much healthier than white flour, and the recipe typically calls for white flour. The wheat flour we're going to use is by Bob's Red Mill. This is my favorite. I always have it stocked in the house, and I use it for several reasons. Wheat flour is not as highly processed as white flour is. That makes it much healthier for you in general. Because it's not refined and because it's not as heavily processed as white flour, it has higher dietary fibers. It has higher vitamins in B1, 3, and 5, and it's also lower on the glycemic index for blood sugar. So those of you who are trying to lower your blood sugar, wheat flour is a great substitute to use in a lot of different recipes. I even use it in a crepe recipe, and that'll be up on another episode. But I always tend to use wheat flour over white flour. I never have white bread in the house. I always have wheat bread, much to my husband's dismay. And it can be used in so many different recipes that gives it a really nutty, earthy flavor. The other ingredient that we're going to swap out is the tuna. So the recipe calls for tuna in oil. We're going to use tuna in water. Now, tuna is a great source of protein in general, but the tuna in water is lower in cholesterol and higher in omega-3s, and it's also lower in fat because it's not in oil, it's in water. I also tend to use mushrooms, more of the mushrooms than the peas. I do this for two reasons. Number one, I love mushrooms, so I put a higher quantity of the mushroom in the tuna noodle casserole than I do versus the peas. Mushrooms are a great source of protein, potassium, niacin, and a key ingredient, selenium. Selenium is an antioxidant mineral. It's not found in a lot of vegetables, so the ones it is found in, it's a rich source of antioxidant. It's a really great healing mineral and actually can help combat a lot of different diseases. It's also found in fennel. It's very high, there's a very high concentration of it in fennel. So I love mushrooms. Now peas are great in this recipe, but peas, just like carrots, are higher in natural sugars. So I tend to cut the peas a little bit in half, and I add more mushrooms to the dish. The other ingredient that we're going to be swapping out is, instead of white breadcrumbs, I use whole wheat breadcrumbs, and you can also use multigrain breadcrumbs as well. Again, it's that same concept of whole wheat flour versus the white flour and the processed refined flours and sugars that are in the dish. So I swap out the breadcrumbs instead of white breadcrumbs. Now, the other ingredient it calls for is chicken broth. Chicken broth is chicken broth. You can pretty much buy whatever brand that you like. I always make sure though that I look for less sodium, because you can always control the salt that you put into the dish on your own, kind of taste it and go with what feels right to you. So it's always better to get chicken broth that's less sodium, and then you can add a little bit more salt and pepper to taste as you go along. Because I'm lactose intolerant, mildly lactose intolerant now, more so than I used to be, and I'll explain that in a later episode as well, I tend to use Lactaid milk. I absolutely love Lactaid milk, but I always get fat-free. And if I do use regular milk, I'm always using a fat-free regular milk because it's lower in sugars and it is lower in cholesterol. It still tastes just as great. It's not as watery as people think it is, and Lactaid milk is actually extremely healthy for you. You get just as much calcium, vitamin, and minerals as you would in any other milk brand. So for me, I use Lactaid milk and I use fat-free. The recipe calls for whole milk, so this is another great alternative for your tuna noodle casserole. Now, it calls for egg noodles. Egg noodles are a really easy noodle to make. They're very quick to cook, and there's actually nothing wrong with egg noodles. They're low in cholesterol, and they're actually considered a heart-healthy food. So the egg noodles are a great call to the recipe, and I think it's a great idea to use egg noodles because they're heartier, and it kind of mixes everything together and just kind of takes all the mushrooms and the peas, and it actually holds the dish really well. The other thing I swap out, the recipe calls for cheddar cheese. I use Sharp Parm aged Parmigiano cheese. The reason I do this is because aged cheese actually has less lactose in it, so it's easier for me to tolerate. It's also lower in cholesterols, lower in sugars, and a lot of the aged cheeses tend to be part skim. So they're lower in fats than some of your other cheeses like cheddar and soft cheeses. So that's a simple swap. Really easy to go to the store and to be able to get something like a Sharp Parm versus a cheddar. It tastes just as good and you're still getting kind of that salty flavor from the cheese. And I actually like the aged cheese much better than the cheddar cheese that it typically calls for. So those are primarily the ingredients that I swap out. The other thing that the recipe calls for that I really love is cooking sherry. Now, sherry isn't used a whole lot in dishes anymore. A lot of chefs still use sherry, but the big thing is that you have to reduce the sherry down when you're cooking it. Now, the sherry is put into the mushrooms when you're making the dish before you add the roux. And the roux is what the flour is going to be with the butter. Now, all of it is stamped out in the recipe, and I'll show you bits and pieces as we go along what the recipe looks like as it's being cooked. But because the recipe is stamped out, I'm not actually going to cook the dish for you, but I'm trying to give you an idea of what you can do when you make this recipe yourself. Sherry's got a great nutty, earthy flavor, and it just has a great taste to it. So I love using sherry in this recipe, and I think it's really fun to use. Those are the ingredients I swap out. It's not very hard to do. These are simple things that you can keep in your house all the time. And for a dish like tuna noodle casserole, it's very easy to swap out these ingredients for the one ingredients that they call for in the typical recipe. The other thing too is that tuna noodle casserole is not that hard to make. It's really quick, very simple, and it shouldn't take you more than a half an hour to 40 minutes, including prep time. This is part of your roux. So I'm taking my Lactaid milk and I'm mixing it in to the base, and roux is a base of flour and butter. So after I put that mixture together, the milk is what I'm adding next. You're going to add the mushroom mixture to the roux once the roux gets going. Now you add your tuna. Again, this is canned tuna and water. Next, you're going to add the peas. You can use any type of pea, even a frozen pea, and you'll add this to the mixture. Next, you're going to assemble the entire dish. You want to take your roux, your mushrooms, your peas, the sauce you just put together, and you want to mix that into the noodles, the egg noodles that you've already cooked. You want the egg noodles to be al dente, meaning not fully cooked through, slightly hard, and then you're going to put this entire mixture in the oven to bake for a little while. You'll add your Parmigiano cheese on top of this right before you put it in the oven. Last, you take it out and you let your dish rest for roughly 3 to 5 minutes so that it cools just a little bit. And then you have a perfect, beautiful tuna noodle casserole that's just slightly healthier, and you got to take control over some of the ingredients that you put into the dish. Please share your comments with me down below. Visit my website at smtraphagen.com. And if you have any other tips or suggestions, please feel free to add them. Also, I'll have this recipe on my website with some pictures and some other information as to how to cook the recipe if you really want it, but you can also find it at the cooking channel, and I'll make sure that that's right here below at the bottom of the screen. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time on Food for Thought.